Yes, my name is Stephanie Andrews, and I've actually got two different things I'm doing in VR these days, and I'm going to use this talk to talk almost exclusively about what I'm doing on my PhD as opposed to what I'm doing as a creative director for Liminal VR, although that is also very interesting, and you should look up the company. We're doing research in psychology, positive psychological experiences in VR. So I work part-time for them as a creative director, but I'm actually going to concentrate on what I'm doing for my PhD, which is exploring and producing artworks for with the idea of unnatural spaces and multiple realities, putting the virtual back in virtual reality. So it's quite it's a somewhat abstract idea, and hopefully by the end of the talk it'll make a little bit more sense what I'm talking about. But I do really recommend that you stay and check out the demo experiences at the end, because they show you things that you actually can't see without being in VR, like physically can't see. So just a bit about me. I have kind of an interesting background, which is I've gone between commercial 3D animation, academic research and lecturing. I was actually a lecturer in the States full-time for a good 6 years at the University of Washington, and then like experimental, almost underground-ish kind of artworks and installations and things like that. So I have an odd Venn diagram of a life in which the intersection in the middle is kind of where I try to hang out with various amounts of success. I did in fact start my my career as a technical director at Pixar. It's okay if that's the only thing you ever remember about me. I've kind of accepted the fact that that's probably what's going to be on my gravestone. But I've actually done a lot of other things as well, which is I've worked with kinetic sculpture, holography, neon installations, motion capture, and as I said, I've done a lot of work in curriculum and grant writing and things like that as well. And so I will talk a little bit briefly about some of the projects that I've done in the past and how they relate to the current work that I'm doing now. So I will start off with what I kind of term in a way as my origin story for what I'm interested in about unnatural spaces or synthetic spaces in computer graphics. And that does go back to the Pixar days. So long ago on a continent far, far away, I sat in a tiny little darkened room for 80 plus hours a week and manipulated virtual lights on the screen, lighting computer graphics environments for A Bug's Life.
I love that movie.
See, I've already got my claim to fame done with. I don't have to worry about anything else. Like the circus sequence in A Bug's Life was I lit a lot of that and stuff. And anyway, so yes, I sat in a tiny darkened room, manipulating these virtual lights for way too many hours in a row, and I would occasionally have to work, more than occasionally have to work overnight or something like that, and I'd barely see the sun for a while. I'd crawl out of my little cave and I'd see the sunlight in the parking lot when I was going home at 2 in the afternoon because I'd been there for 3 days or something like that. Well, there's one time I walked out of that experience, and you have to understand, in at the time in A Bug's Life, we did all these things with lights that aren't physically really possible. You could actually change the shadow direction from where the light direction was, and all of these non-realistic kind of little tweaks to make the scenes look better and to make the story read better. Really standard. So it was all malleable to me. I walk out into the parking lot one day, and the sun is out, and there's some shadows coming down through the trees, going under the car. And my first immediate thought is, this scene would look so much better if the shadows were just 15 degrees that way. And I don't think I've actually ever been the same since. So the idea being that, like, I realized, I guess there's just this kind of fundamental core of, oh, we get to manipulate everything in computer graphics if we want to. Everything, right? It's all up for grabs, actually. Now, we do a lot of things in computer graphics to try to emulate reality in one way. A lot of things to try to emulate reality. Materials, grid systems, Euclidean space, all like heaps and heaps of things to try to deal with real stuff. But I got really interested over time in what can we do that's completely unnatural and not like reality at all. And what could we experience by doing that? So since then, after I left Pixar, I got a master's degree at the Art Institute of Chicago doing crazy experimental artworks. And I worked with things like neon sculptures that were animated and had like reflective materials that you could look through. It was never the same thing from the same side since, had this really kind of nebulous feeling of the space in it. I did some work with, I got really interested in stereo photography, so this is how I get into the stereo and VR stuff, and doing like a light capture and performance capture over extended period of time, and then capturing that in stereoscopic photography. And more recently, I've done some projects that, this one up here is actually purposefully using panoramic software, like purposely breaking panoramic software to make interesting images. So instead of causing it to stitch perfectly in a nice circle like you want, actually training it and photographing a series of things to get it to glitch out and like repeat the same image again and again to try to actually build up really interesting images that way. So I'm very into kind of undermining the algorithms and using them to my own various purposes. This project down in the corner was, there's been a lot of work since this, but this was like 2008. It was actually done with dance capture. I worked with a choreographer to make, with the end idea of making sculptural forms based on how they did choreography, as opposed to the dance itself. So that's a motion capture re-rendered as a sculptural form. And then very recently, after I started my PhD, I did my first project that I did towards my PhD was at the Motion Lab with Jordan Vincent and John McCormick, which was an interesting project where we actually, I'll just describe it really briefly. It was a total void. There was no environment whatsoever. You started off the VR experience and you looked down and your body was made of particles of light or particles of dark, depending on the version. And as time went on, the particles actually left you, like left your body, floated off into space and became a disembodied form that would actually move and kind of mimic with you back and forth. So again, kind of trying to play with space and identity and things like that in virtual reality. Okay, so now that's a bit about my background and kind of the things I'm interested in and how I've got to thinking about what I'm working on right now. And so I want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by unnatural spaces. And I look to certain art movements as a good way to think about these things. That's the work of the Surrealists, the Cubists, and of course, our friend and constant companion, Escher. And all of these are kind of early 20th century attempts, and they're really strongly linked with ideas that are happening in physics and in urban spaces and all sorts of perceptual science. Artists get really inspired by these ideas and decide, hey, we don't have to try to make things work in perspective anymore. We don't have to worry about it. We're gonna do different things. We're going to try to see space and depict space in a different way. So in particular, the Cubists had this idea of basically trying to portray an interpretation or an essence of a scene by depicting multiple viewpoints and multiple perspectives at one time on one plane of a painting, right? This whole huge body of work that gets done around this basic concept. And that is probably the closest analogy I could draw to what I'm trying to do in VR, which is basically portray the idea of multiple spaces and interpretations of reality, but instead of compressing it down onto a flat painting, actually have it being an entire environment around you, right? So completely expanding that idea out into three-dimensional virtual space, stereoscopically. And I really love this quote up here because I think it's a great tie-in with the idea of technology and what we're doing in computer graphics versus what people have explored, in various art movements. A combination of local and global tools is not exclusive to mathematics or painting. When you are working, I don't know how many people, probably a lot of you are familiar, but when you're working in 3D graphic spaces, you'll have local orientations for objects, you'll have a global orientation for the whole space, right? There's all sorts of going back and forth between those things. It's really got a lot conceptually kind of similar to some really interesting art practices as well. Before I get into the projects that I've been working on, I want to mention a couple other projects that I think are pretty interesting. They're not quite what I'm doing, but they're interesting to think about, interesting to look at. The first one is Unfolding Space, which was made in 2006 by Julieta Aguilera, which was for the CAVE system. The CAVE system is a 4-wall stereoscopic projection system. So instead of VR where you put the headset on, it's like you're inside a stereo projection from every side. Look at it from Polaris glasses. So you're in a whole room. And the second project is 4D Toys by Mark ten Bosch, that's been made just for the HTC Vive. You can actually download this on Steam if you have a Vive and play with it. I'm going to just pop out of this really quickly and show you just a touch of the video. This is the video from Unfolding Space. Bear in mind, this is from 2006. And what she's done is actually created an environment where you are moving through hyperspace, actually a 4-dimensional representation of space. So those different angles, the different lines that you're seeing her manipulate are actually sides of hypercubes, tesseracts, and you're manipulating, going through that environment by hand gestures and arm gestures. So you're inside a 4-dimensional space in VR. Which, if you're familiar with 4-dimensional spaces, they do all sorts of interesting, wacky things with disappearing and merging out and coming appearing and disappearing and things like that. So that's one inspirational project. And then, like I said, this just recently got released, 4D Toys. And play for me? Oh, I'm not getting much love out of that. Let's try this guy. There we go. Okay. So 4D Toys kind of has a similar idea. Again, this is a VR experience, but instead of being inside a 4-dimensional space, you're more in like God mode, and you're manipulating 4D objects, and you can put them out, and you can manipulate them and do little simple puzzles and things like that. But you can see that the geometry acts in really bizarre and unexpected ways. I don't have quite the scope in this talk to explain exactly what's going on, but check this out on your own if you want to understand more about what's happening with these objects. So both of those projects they're interesting to me, but I am working on something that's a little bit more based in the idea of being, instead of strictly interpretations of mathematical geometric principles, I want to kind of explore them more from an artistic, or some of these ideas more from an artistic context. So I'm not actually using any four-dimensional geometry in my projects so far, but I am breaking up and reinterpreting the space in virtual reality in a way that I haven't really seen other people do before. So these are my research questions. I'm doing what's called a practice-based PhD, which means I get to make lots of stuff and write about it, but I get to make lots of stuff and also write about it. My research questions then are about actually the art practice and what's involved in making. How does intentionally composing non-naturalistic stereoscopic spatial representations offer new strategies to my work as a time-based media artist? And furthermore, what types of new experiences can I create that are exclusively perceivable only in the domain of stereoscopic digital media and virtual reality? And that's an important one. Like, you can't really get the entire experience of what's going on in the projects that I'm working on without seeing it in stereo, and particularly VR, but at least in stereo. So along those lines, I did a variety of virtual reality experiments. These are, I wouldn't call these like finished artworks, but they were kind of like just experiments with ideas along the way. And I'm going to talk about these three ones: Penrose triangle, well, it's kind of two, these stereospheres, magic cubes, and then finally ghost forests, before I talk about shards, which is my current iteration of things. So you probably a lot of you are familiar with that illusion, the Penrose triangle, right? Which again really should only work if it's in 2D, right? The whole thing of it is that, like, oh, it looks like it's 3D, but it's actually 2D. You can actually build a sculptural version of a Penrose triangle in the real world. It's quite difficult. You have to get the lighting conditions right, and you have to stand at exactly the right angle, and all of these things to kind of get it to work. But you can make a sculptural version. But I wanted to play with the idea of taking it a step farther in VR, where it would be a sculptural, like basically a 3D version of a Penrose triangle that still works as an illusion at the right distance, but actually you couldn't build as a sculpture, as a physical sculpture. So that worked. I figured out how to do it. This is it from a distance at the top. That is the same thing as down below. When it starts to get close to you, completely breaks apart into this huge distances from front to back, like spread out all across the place. So that was kind of interesting, but it didn't quite match the thing of being stereoscopically perceivable only, quite. So then I tried this other one, and that looks like the driest thing in the world, right? It kind of is, but it was a really important little test. And I'm going to explain what's going on here. It's actually quite interesting to see in VR as well. When you look at this in 2D, right? If I take a capture of only one side of the stereo screen, it just looks like flat spheres in an H shape, completely all on the same plane, nothing interesting going on. What's actually happening is that that's the camera, so that would be like where your head is, your eye is in the scene. That's the stack of spheres that's on the left side, that little tiny stack right down there. The one that's on the left side, super close to your eye. The really big stack of spheres is the one on the right side, and then the one that's in between is actually a sphere that goes from the back stack to the front stack. But I've removed basically all monoscopic depth cues from the scene, so there's nothing to tell you with occlusion or lighting or anything like that, what's in front and what's behind. The only way when you see this in stereo, you will see there's a massive difference in depth, but the only thing that's left is the stereo effect, the binocular rivalry between your two eyes. And what's happening is that everything is very carefully compensated for the amount of size on the screen, and as it moves across, so that you have no other cues left over for it. Again, this was interesting to me because it was stripping away all of the other things and getting down to the core of stereoscopic. So then I did this experiment, found this experiment, which is an idea where, so if you imagine like the game Portal or something like that, right? You have a portal in space, you can see a different world through that, through that one like flat portal. This is a cube that rotates around, and each side of the cube reveals a different piece of geometry on the inside of it, which is pretty fun. Like, that's kind of fun to look at. It gets really fun when you throw a whole stack of these things in the scene and rotate them all around at the same time. And that was the moment, actually, when I did that, that was the moment where I was like, aha, now this is different. Like, you can't, it's not really the same to see this in another environment, because the different pieces reveal in front and behind. I'm going to explain a little bit more about this as we go. How long? Has anyone been timing? I hope I'm not going too long.
3 more minutes, if you want to keep it at 20.
Michael, a little long? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. I'll skip showing that video now. Okay. So then, Ghost Forest is a VR art installation. It's more complex, and it has a much more subtle orientation in the space than the video's working. Yeah, has a much subtler distortion and layering of the space than the stereo cube environment did. You can see part of the effect here, where some things seem to be partially behind and partially in front of other things, kind of sliding by at some odd parallax. Again, when you're in the environment, certain pieces of geometry appear to like kind of appear out of nowhere in front of you and then like disappear into the back. And there's this whole complex spatial setting for that as well. I chose the idea of a forest to reference the idea of landscape, because it turns out that when we judge distances and things, horizon lines and known forms like trees have a very strong anchoring effect in how we perceive things beyond just whether something's in front or back. Those have an influence on how we think about space as well, identifiable features of landscape. So I wanted to play with, again, kind of disrupting a landscape environment. Okay, so I'm going to explain a little bit more what's actually happening in this that makes it, that gives this effect. The best way to do it is by thinking about the moon in the space. So if you can imagine, the moon is actually made up of 3 spheres in my project. You have one sphere in the front, like this. You've got another one in the back. Both of these have the actual moon texture on them, right? That looks like a moon. In the middle, there's a 3rd sphere that's invisible. That sphere is the key to everything. When you look into that sphere, you can see the part of the moon that's in the back, right? Through that sphere. And you can see the part of the moon that's in the front, but only through the lens of that object in the middle. It's pretty weird. In the experience, you see them kind of slide past each other and like disappear on the edges. So all of the other things in the scene are kind of based on the same principles. Some fully 3-dimensional objects are actually 3D portals to reveal other things in the environment, both in front of and behind those objects. So instead of just being a flat plane in space, a window that you stick your arm through, the whole object, and it doesn't just reveal things behind the window, it reveals things in front of the window as well, which is where things start to get really interesting, really complex kind of spaces layering up.
Does this affect people's balance?
I have really had no major complaints from it.
Oh.
Because one of the things was I didn't want to make, I didn't want it, because it's easy to do like binocular rivalry that just makes people throw up immediately. Like it's It's so easy, you know, like, so one of the goals was absolutely to make it so that it was still interesting, really artistically rich experience, but actually not too disruptive. I haven't had any problems yet. I think if you maybe were very prone to migraines, or very, maybe, but other than that, it has been fine. But I know a lot of other tricks that I'm using to also not disrupt people at the same time. So, design tricks for VR. Okay, so my current iteration is still kind of prototypey, but that's what I'm going to show you tonight. It's called Shards. And Shards is an interactive experience where you can throw cubes into the environment. And there's actually 4 different spaces that exist in the same world at the same time. And each cube, depending on where you throw it in from, is only visible through that particular one. You can throw multiples of a particular environment out, but they're all there, but you can only see them through the particular cube portals in the space. They become reality cubes. Yeah, so this is another video of this. Again, you can see some of the effect in 2D. There's a more marked depth, this whole depth kind of language that happens when it's actually in VR as well. So this to me is really starting to get to the idea of stereoscopic virtual cubism, going back to the idea of cubism, multiple perspectives existing in the same environment at the same time, with some fun, interactive elements in it that people get to play with. Yeah.
So if you throw multiple cubes out,
Yeah.
are you looking at the same perspective through them? Like if you just threw all of the same cube out, would you end up with one image? Yeah.
At the moment, yeah. They're all, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
There's a lot of extra fun that could be done.
Yeah.
But at the moment, yeah.
Cool.
So it ultimately ends up being this kind of really interwoven, fractured, spatial environment that you're in, with little pocket universes collecting on top of each other. So that's the main demo that I was going to show tonight, the next project that I'm working on, well, I haven't started on yet, but so I'm just at the conceptual stage of this one, is called Kaleidoscope, which is going to take the same idea of these 3D, this morphing 3-dimensional portal, multi-layered, stereoscopic, really interesting, but basically you make it into more of an interesting experience for the user, and also kind of go to the idea of being a whole architectural space. So it's basically like you're inside a kaleidoscope. You get to manipulate the little pieces that would be inside of, like the little gems and the little things inside a kaleidoscope that make it all pretty. You get to move them around, and when you move them around, they reflect around you as a whole, like, architectural space. So you're inside, it's a kaleidoscope, but you're inside of it, and it also has these strange stereoscopic 3D effects of things popping forward and back and being, and emerging and collapsing. There will also be a lot of fun with collisions. So you can, you throw little objects around, they'll collide, cause a domino effect, and those effects will like ripple through the whole like space around you as you're going. Okay. So thank you. If you would like to interact with me at all, please do. I like friends. So my Twitter is @StephNet, and LinkedIn I also use a lot for professional contacts. I really like it. And working on PhD candidate at RMIT University, so if you're interested in any of these other ideas or want to have a chat sometime, let me know. Thank you.